How does e-commerce support the global integration of African markets and the expansion of SMEs?
For much of what's required from an SME does not necessarily require an investment. It requires political will.
This is Trade Finance Talks, your go-to podcast on cross-border trade, brought to you by Trade Finance Global.
Hello and welcome back to Trade Finance Talks. I'm Mahika Ravishankar, Deputy Editor at Trade Finance Global. I'm excited to be back talking about Africa today, about continental free trade agreements and the benefits of connectivity more generally, whether that's ideologically or physically, over a vast and pretty disparate continent. So I'm excited to have Henny Heymans on the podcast, who is the CEO of Sub-Saharan DHL Express. We speak about that connectivity, but also about what more can be done to attract investment onto the continent so that exporters can participate better in global trade networks. I'm pretty passionate about this subject, and it's a really fascinating discussion. So, Henny, welcome to Trade Finance Talks.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Please start by introducing yourself and telling me about your role within DHL.
So my name is Henny Heymans. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for DHL Express Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm based in Johannesburg, and a wonderful privilege to say I look after all of Sub-Saharan Africa, all 51 countries. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because we're the only organization in the world, regardless of industry, that's actually present in every single country and or territory in Sub-Saharan Africa. So yeah, and it's it's my privilege to lead approximately 3,000 odd people, and it's my privilege to keep this continent connected to the world and the world connected to this continent.
And what does DHL Express do compared with DHL?
I represent DHL Express, which is the entity that's in over 220 countries around the world. And as I've said earlier, the only one that's present in all countries and territories in Sub-Saharan Africa. So we look after the time-definite international shipments of our customers. What does it mean? So we pick up a parcel today in Ghana and we deliver it in London tomorrow. Or we pick up a parcel in India this afternoon and we deliver it to Lagos tomorrow. So it's all about that time-definite international cross-border move. That's the job that we do. And I think, this is a great kind of a segue to talk a little bit about that. I think often when you talk about DHL Express, people think of a little envelope. And they think, these are the guys I give my little envelopes to. And quite to the contrary, we can easily ship up to 3,000 kilograms per shipment. So we've moved and we've evolved, as logistics has evolved over time. We too have evolved in that sense.
Thank you, Henny. Your representation in 51 of the countries across Africa gives you, I think, a good vantage point to discuss the impact of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or the AfCFTA. How has that supported regional integration and connectivity across the continent?
It's a twofold answer to the question. I think the African Free Trade Agreement links 1.3 billion consumers, or provides a mechanism to link that. And it's, across the territory, it's about a $3.4 trillion GDP or economy that you're talking about. So what's the significance of that? I mean, there's a couple of points to it. The first one is it creates a shared framework, so people can kind of prepare and plan across a single set of rules, whereas at the moment it's very fragmented. The second part is we're going from policy to practice. Now, often when I speak to people, they go, "Oh, Henny, there's nothing happening with the scene." Sometimes we are just simply too impatient. And I often compare this to European Union. It took the European Union 50 years to get together and kind of make this thing work. The African Free Trade Agreement has not been in play for 50 years. I know you're going to say to me how long? I think it's about 12 or 13 years, whatever the case may be. This is a journey. This is not a process. It's not an event. So, I think we really need to be cognizant of that. And I'll talk a little bit about how I think world events are potentially accelerating that journey. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later. The other role that the Africa Free Trade Agreement is playing is it's enabling and fast-tracking infrastructure investment. Because you need infrastructure if you want to trade. And we often talk about it, that infrastructure on this continent lacks. But certainly the Africa Free Trade Agreement will actually build that pressure from the bottom up. That requirement for infrastructure will now be driven from the bottom up. So, so those are probably the three things I'd say in terms of the Africa Free Trade Agreement. Maybe just a little bit in terms of why did I say that world events are accelerating it. If you think about what's happening at the moment, you've got the war that broke out, Russia, Ukraine, a while back now already, and still, apparently no end in sight. Unfortunately, you've got the war in the Middle East. So we've got to, lift our gaze and look to trading partners differently. We also had the events last year in terms of the tariff announcements that came out of the US, and on top of that, you had USA that got ripped out of the continent. Now, for me, those all represent opportunities. So you've got the Africa Free Trade Agreement, so that's an opportunity. If we've got to look for different trade partners, while charity starts at home, then why not look intra-Africa? And that's such a great opportunity for us. So forcing us to shift our gaze perhaps a little quicker than what we would have under normal circumstances, forcing us to look at how we trade with the rest of the world in terms of going from aid to trade. So I think that's accelerating it. And the entire saga that we had from a duty perspective, two benefits. So one is the Africa Free Trade Agreement that we've spoken, so that intra-Africa trade opportunity, it's accelerating that, but it's also allowing us to look at different trade partners around the world. So a long answer to a very short question, but those are my thoughts around it.
Inter-African connectivity has improved, but how have these events impacted Africa's access to international markets?
It certainly has changed it, but in my mind, we should never forget that international trade is like water. It will find a way. And a little bit to my point earlier, where we're shifting our gaze from a continental point of view, this is exactly what's happening. We are shifting our gaze. And of course, there's a short-term impact as you start looking for other partners to replace what's being impacted by the war. But overall, the momentum is continuing in the region. If you look at the DHL connectedness tracker that we've published a couple of weeks ago, Africa has recorded the strongest trade value growth of any region. How wonderful is that? How often do we hear Africa on top of tables and league tables like that? And by growing faster, assume our position insofar as global trade is concerned. So I just see upside in all of this.
So do I, actually. Any industry events we've attended in the last year or so, the topic of Africa's value is inevitable and it's major. Whether that's investing in the continent or improving access to finance there. In general, as a continent, Africa is growing exponentially. So I want to now move to talk a little bit about the engines behind Africa's growth. SMEs and MSMEs account for over 90% of businesses in Africa. How have the trends which we've just been discussing impacted SMEs? What are the main barriers they face when they're looking to enter global markets?
It's a great question. I'm probably one of the biggest supporters for SMEs, and I'm also incredibly lucky that I look after our Go Trade program within DHL. And our Go Trade program is actually structured to help execute on our purpose of connecting people and improving lives. And our Go Trade program has got two pillars. So we talk about trade facilitation and we talk about capacitating, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But just back to your point, how's it impacted SMEs? For me, the impact is a positive one. Why is it a positive one? We see a lot more people looking towards Africa at the moment because of what's happening in the world. You've just mentioned it. SMEs make up 90% of businesses. That's interesting enough, not just in Africa, that's actually globally. That is actually a global statistic. Globally, SMEs contribute over 70% of employment opportunities. So a wonderful engine to turn to help us accelerate trading ourselves to a position of wealth from a continental point of view. But there are challenges, for sure. The first one is around compliance, probably. And this is where they've got to navigate these perceived complexities around doing business cross-border. And again, this is where our Go Trade program comes in from a capacitating point of view, because those are the issues that we address under the Go Trade program. And then, the second part is really just the practical know-how. How do I do this? I think oftentimes we get so caught up in the theory and the academics of things. And, an SME is generally a very practical individual. They just want to know, how do I get my shipment from A to B in the shortest possible, most effective way? So it's that practical know-how is often the second barrier that they face. And then logistics reliability. Now, that is particular to Africa because of the lack of infrastructure. And this is why I'm so proud of representing DHL, because we're the only integrator on this continent that's got our own dedicated airline. Now, why is that important? It is important because that is what's providing that infrastructure in the absence of anybody else providing that infrastructure. And then spoken about most often is the access to finance. We often talk about FDI, and we often, I read a statistic that spoke about, I think it's a 75% increase in FDI in Africa. You've got to ask yourself, how does the SME today and tomorrow benefit from that investment? And unfortunately, the answer is not necessarily immediately. Why is that? Huge part of that investment is in infrastructure. Now, that will in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time benefit the SME, but not today. Much of that investment potentially sits in balance sheets. So it doesn't give the SME operational funding so they can create scale and create extra capacity. So the access to finance is today still one of the bigger challenges that our SMEs face. So, that's probably part of what I would say. And then our digital readiness. Now, I read an article actually last night that said that digital economy in Africa is accelerating really, really nicely. And this is again where the Africa Free Trade Agreement comes into play and that PAPS payment system. So we've got all of these different elements that are in play. It's now about connecting those dots. But we're all impatient. We all want it to happen tomorrow. And perhaps, at the moment, you've got about 18 countries that's part of this payment system under the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And there's about 50 banks that have signed up. At the moment, still mostly used by corporates. And it's probably a little bit of a let's try and see how this thing works out. And as we encounter challenges and issues, that's getting fixed. And pretty soon, I speak under correction, I think in about June, there'll be a customer facing element or part or that being launched. So all of those things will help address much of what you now have spoken about so far. And in particular, if we look at the challenges they face, look at Africa. There's nobody that wants to deal in Malawi and Kwacha, just by way of example. PAPS will help enable that. Because now you've got to say to that SME, well, you've got to go find dollars or euros. PAPS is taking away that pain. So it's a really important pain point that PAPS is hoping to address. So, yeah, again, a very long answer to a short question, but I hope this gives you a little bit of a flavor of what I believe are some of the challenges out there.
No, definitely. And I want to talk a little bit more about the Go Trade initiative within DHL, which you touched on. But what exactly does that look like in practice? What kind of knowledge and tools are you sharing with SMEs? If you could talk me through like how DHL goes and finds the SME, that whole timeline, I think it would be quite useful.
Yeah, fantastic question. So Go Trade's got two pillars to it. The one is around trade facilitation and the other one's around public partnerships. Let me maybe concentrate on the capacity generation element of it. What DHL is doing through our Go Trade programs is we're building an ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, we bring along partners that can help address the four challenges that are the main challenges for the SMEs. And you and I have touched on them. So it's the access to finance, knowledge, ICT, and logistics. So what we then do is we bring those partners together under this Go Trade ecosystem. And we then meet up with the SMEs. So we will have physical training sessions with those SMEs, and we will go through structured, short burst training sessions that'll help them with that practical how-to that you and I spoke about earlier on in this conversation. Now, we've divided the life cycle of SMEs into 4 buckets, if you want. And if I can just briefly explain those, the first bucket is where I have an idea. Henny wants to start manufacturing pens, but I haven't quite got it together yet. The second bucket is I'm now producing pens, not necessarily on a regular basis because I'm struggling finding customers and I'm struggling a little bit with the cash flow. I've got a few quality issues, but at least I'm manufacturing something. So that's a second bucket. The third bucket is where I'm now producing these pens on a regular output schedule, or I provide a service on a regular output schedule. And I'm in business. My business is working, it's generating a little bit of cash flow, and I've got regular orders. That's the third bucket. But it's also at a point now where whilst I'm in this third bucket, where I'm starting to think, how do I expand my business? How do I take this business further? And inevitably, cross-border then creeps into my thinking. Now we move into bucket number 4. Now I'm ready to go. I need to find customers for these yellow pens of mine so that I can start exporting. So having in mind that we've got those 4 buckets, our training modules are aligned with those different stages of the SME life cycle. So when we bring the SMEs together under that ecosystem Go Trade banner, we identify clearly in which bucket they sit, and our training modules is then specifically focused on that specific point in time, that bucket where the SME finds themselves in. So we've got all of these great players that then comes onto board in terms of, is it a digital tool that they require? Is it helping them with access to a marketplace, for example? Is it understanding that practical know-how? Is it finding a partner that can help with the financing that is tailor-made for SMEs, not corporates? Because we know that that process and those requirements are very, very different. So that's at the very heart of Go Trade. And then, of course, we keep on feeding information. And if you had to say to me, give me an example, there's a wonderful example right now where China has removed the import duties and tariffs. So part of what we do under this Go Trade banner and program is we now share that information with the SMEs and say, did you hear? Did you know? And this is how it'll play potentially into what you do. So that's probably as succinct as I can be in terms of what Go Trade is all about and our efforts around it.
I think it's a really valuable sort of initiative to be rolling out. I would hope that other companies doing similar things, but I guess DHL is working much more directly with those SMEs.
Your point is a valid one, and I think it's the age-old Africa saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And we would love to have some of those organizations, look us up and say, hey, I want to be a part of that Go Trade ecosystem, because that's how we will go further. I think sometimes we run the risk that every organization wants to say, I have done this. If we can change the I with a we, I think that collective will be so much more impactful over the long run. So I really hope if there are corporates listening out there, if there are organizations that feel they can partner up with us, be it around access to finance, be it around the knowledge pillar, be it around, the ICT, reach out and help drive this growth engine for this wonderful African continent we all call home.
Oh, definitely. I want to talk now a bit about e-commerce. How does e-commerce support African market integration and the expansion of SMEs that we've been talking about?
So I think, given the nature of the African economy, outside of your maybe 24 really big multinational corporates, this African economy is made up of SMEs. How do SMEs get their product into their customer base? It is through digitalization, it's through e-commerce. So I think there are 2 things that's important here. The first one is they've got to be online. And I know it sounds incredibly basic, but believe you me, if you go to a city like Mombasa, for example, or even in South Africa, as you go to some of our smaller cities outside of the major hubs, a simple thing like connectivity is an issue. Affordable connectivity, let me just add that, affordable connectivity becomes an issue. So e-commerce helps us a little bit in terms of that. It is still probably the cheapest entry point into the market for sure. But then they've got to be operationally enabled. So being online is one thing, but you've got to be operationally enabled. And that means that you've got to have an integrated platform. Your shipping should be on there. The taxes should be on there. The payment system should be on there. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated for our SMEs. Hence, again, the importance of bringing together this ecosystem under the Go Trade so we can assist and help with that. Because by doing that, you create economies of scale. So rather than each SME going out on her or his own to try and do that, let's bring it together under a combined program where we can then offer scale and accessibility. And then we keep on going back to logistics, not because I'm in logistics, but because logistics is such a vital part of the economy. And it's no different whether you're an enormous conglomerate or whether you're an SME. You need reliable, predictable logistics. And that's the other part that I think often our SMEs struggle with in the execution around that. So, that's probably how I'd respond to that question.
Thank you, Henny, and definitely a nice collaborative sentiment that you've captured there. I want to touch a bit on your point of digital infrastructure providers and move now to talking about e-commerce. How does e-commerce support the global integration of African markets and the expansion of SMEs that's been the subject of this discussion so far?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure that I have a straight answer for you. And the reason why I say that is because we're so infrastructure poor at the moment. We need connectivity. For the African economy to grow efficiently and effectively, we need infrastructure. And I made the point earlier, our SMEs will not necessarily benefit from that immediately. But let's just for a moment think about connectivity. And I spoke earlier about being the only integrator that's got its own dedicated air fleet. But if we can get better air connectivity, by way of example, we get better access to markets and we get quicker access to markets. One of the challenges we have is that because of the lack of infrastructure, the cost of logistics adds up to 45% to the final cost of goods. That makes us uncompetitive out of the starting gates. That's why we need the improved infrastructure. The second part of how do we make the SME benefit from that is to make sure that that investment goes into the ICT infrastructure, that accessibility to connectivity. And it's got to go beyond the main centers. It's got to go beyond the Nairobis. It's got to go beyond the Lagos. It's got to go beyond a Dakar. It's got to go beyond the Johannesburg. We've got to get into the second cities. And these investments should be channeled to connecting those second cities. Africa has got the fastest growth in mega cities of any continent in the world. What are being done at a country level to make sure those mega cities are connected in a way that's efficient and effective for SMEs to allow them to participate in the economy in an effective and competitive manner? So, we spoke about the FDI investment a little bit earlier. Well, I mean, firstly, that number gets a little bit skewed because of the enormous investment that went into Egypt. So if we strip out the Egyptian investment, it's a slightly different picture. Still a good picture. I think it's about a 12% increase in terms of that. But then we've got to go and say, okay, so how much of that 12% will flow through? And that comes back to my answer. The other thing, and it's a closing point I'll make on this, for much of what's required from an SME does not necessarily require an investment. It requires political will. That doesn't necessarily require FDI. Of course, it's boosted by FDI, but we need to have that appreciation and that political awareness and political will to want to enable the SME to help participate in economic growth. So a slightly longer answer probably than what you've anticipated. Those are my
No. On political will, you probably know far better than I, but how much are politicians in Africa focusing on SMEs in particular? Also, where does corruption feed into all of this, which is really prevalent across many African states?
Yeah, fantastic question. So let me deal with the first one. We're definitely seeing far more of an awareness amongst politicians. A couple of examples that I can use. Kenya, for example, is really at the forefront of wanting to enable their SMEs in country. But we're seeing that across the continent or in most parts of the continent. Definitely there's an awakening. Definitely there's an appreciation and also an appreciation for public-private partnerships in terms of how do we enable this holistically at a country level. So for sure, we're seeing an uptick in the awareness and the willingness, no doubt about it. Corruption and the ease of doing business should be top of government agendas. We often talk about ESG. I think for Africa, we should talk about GSE. We should talk about governance first. I wish I had the magical pen that can change how we look at that acronym. And from an African point of view, we should talk about governance first and foremost, and that'll address your point directly. If we can get into an operating rhythm where governance is at the top of everything that we do, for me, it's the oxygen that will feed sustainable economic growth. But we need to get that resolved and sorted. And also, I'm always fascinated by this when I speak about this at gatherings. It's wonderful. Everybody goes, yeah, they should resolve the corruption issue. Well, it takes two to tango. It takes two to tango. And I often wonder how many people who are sitting in the audience are actually participating in that behavior. Because we go, well, that's the only way I can do business. It's not. I can absolutely testify to the fact that it's not. And we're one example, and there are many other corporates. It's not just DHL for sure. But I know that in DHL, compliance is our number one priority, second to our people. People will always be our number one priority. But we operate in every single one of these markets. And in every single one of them, we absolutely comply with legislation. We absolutely operate in a compliant and non-corrupt manner. It's possible, and we've been doing it for decades now. So it is possible. Is it sometimes a little bit harder? Of course it is. Of course it is. But then anything that's worthwhile is not meant to be easy.
Mm-hmm.
So this call out is not just for governments. This call out is for every single person living and making a living on this continent, is to do away with that and say, actually, today, I will do it in a compliant manner. You can plan for it. Will it take a little bit longer? Of course it will.
You're so right to bring
it's
that
an
up.
us, not just a them.
To talk about corruption as a factor which makes African markets more risky, when the same parties who are talking about that corruption are facilitating it, is something that not enough people speak about. So thank you very much for just addressing that head on.
I think it was Barack Obama who said in his very first election campaign, you are the change you've been waiting for. Stop waiting for others. Others are not going to make the difference. Others are not going to stop corruption. If we want to stop corruption, it is up to us as a collective.
Thank you, Henny. We covered a lot of ground and a lot more ground than we set out to discuss. So thank you very much for the discussion.
You're most welcome. Thank you.